Hello and a warm welcome to Tata Literature Live, the 11th annual Mumbai International Litfest and the first one to be completely digital, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects. There will be a 20-minute Q&A at the end of the session, so please do send in your questions in the comments section that you are viewing from, and don't forget to put in your names. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will be singing about the dark times. These words that appear in Bertolt Brecht's Swedenborg poems aptly capture a capacity to hope and rise above hardships. This year has been difficult for us all, but we continue to prevail. Let's celebrate the human spirit with Pandemic Tales, a panel discussion. Our first panelist, Emma Donoghue, is an internationally best-selling author of novels, short stories, plays for stage and radio, biography, and literary history. Her recent novel, The Pull of the Stars, was inspired by the centenary of the Great Flu of 1918 and is set in a Dublin hospital where a nurse, a doctor, and a volunteer helper fight to save patients in a tiny maternity quarantine ward. Our next panelist, Peter May, is a Scottish television screenwriter, novelist, and crime writer whose books have sold over 15 million copies worldwide. His 2005 novel, Lockdown, set in a global pandemic which was once rejected, has not surprisingly become a bestseller this year. Mr. May has pledged to donate the advance amount received for this book, Lockdown, to various charitable organizations involved with supporting health workers, victims, and others suffering as a result of COVID-19. Our third panelist today is Shobhaa, a widely read author and columnist. She is known for her outspoken, irreverent views, making her one of India's most respected opinion shapers. Her writings have consistently chronicled her deeply felt socio-political, cultural concerns. Her book, Lockdown Liaison, is a collection of short stories that capture different moods one might have felt during these trying times. Chairing the discussion is Ayaz Memon, whose journalistic career spans over 40 years. While he is best known as a sports correspondent, he has also been editor of almost every big newspaper in India. Mr. Memon has co-authored and edited India 50, The Making of a Nation, with Ranjana Banerjee, and he also does an internet radio show on planetradiocity.com. A very warm welcome to all our panelists.
Thank you, Gillian. I think that's the cue for me to take over. Just to let you know, I've been kind of parachuted. I was speaking to the panelists, Emma, Shobhaa, and Peter. I've been parachuted into this session, but I'm loving it. I mean, just a couple of hours earlier, I did a workshop on how to, be a good sports writer. And here I am, discussing on the pandemic. So, I mean, you can't, this is an unusual year. And this is a wonderful year, wonderful way things are working out, unraveling. So let me kind of just set the tenor for this session. All three of these books are set in pandemics, as we know, and deal with it in different ways. So I thought we could spend this session talking about these books, obviously in the journeys of the individual authors of writing these books. Talk a little about their similarities, some differences, and maybe also reflect a little about this pandemic in general and what we have learned from it, what we can hope for the future. I hope that meets the approval of all the panelists. If it does, then I'm going to start with my round of questions. I actually hear, like everybody else in the audience, I want to hear more from what they have to say rather than myself. So without much ado, I'll start with Emma. Emma, your book is set in Dublin during the Great Flu in 1918. So tell us a little bit about the storyline without giving too much away. We don't want you to kind of tell us everything about the book. We want to read it. People want to read it, buy it. When did you begin writing it, and why did you choose to set it during the 1918 flu pandemic?
Back in October 2018, I read an article in The Economist magazine. I don't usually read that magazine, but I was on a train and I had forgotten to bring my computer. So I read that magazine cover to cover. And there was a very good article about the centenary of the 1918 flu, which of course I had known about but had never really paid much attention. I think because it is always overshadowed by the World War. So it was the atmosphere of that pandemic that gripped me, the idea of modern life suddenly grinding to a halt and mass death and terror. So I wanted to write a story about the 1918 flu, and I could have said it anywhere because it reached the entire world. But I thought I would go for my hometown of Dublin because then I could get the voice most authentic. And I felt when writing about people dying in a pandemic, it seemed crucial to be absolutely realistic.
And you moved from Dublin to London. Peter, your book, which is set in London, right? And you wrote it, well, way back in 2005. That's 15 years back. And some of, or quite a lot of what you've written has turned out to be prophetic, in the sense that some of the things which you thought might happen have actually turned out to happen. So, what gave you the idea to write about a pandemic causing a global lockdown in 2005? I mean, we know in 2008 the financial meltdown happened. The economies of the Western world, there was a meltdown. But a global pandemic in 2005, what triggered off that kind of thought?
Well, actually, my original inspiration for that came, like Emma, from the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which I'd researched for another book that I'd written around about the turn of the century. And when the SARS epidemic came out of China in around 2003, I was writing a series of books which were set in China at that time. And I had the idea of perhaps setting one of these stories in Beijing during a pandemic lockdown caused by SARS or a virus like SARS, and an investigation of a murder taking place against that background. But as it happened, my China series came to an end. I never got a chance to write that story. And when it came to 2005, I was looking for a story to write. And I went back to that idea, and I went back to my research on the Spanish flu. And I thought, okay, let's set this in a city I know well, which is London. And what are the scientists saying is likely to be the next pandemic? Because at that point, everybody was saying we are in an inter-pandemic period, that another pandemic of some kind is inevitable. And everybody seemed to feel at that point that the next pandemic would be caused by bird flu or avian flu. So that's what I researched, and that's the background and the backdrop I used for writing about my book.
Fabulous. I'll come back to a little bit more about your book, but let me just go quickly to Shobhaa. So your stories, or the work, the short stories that you've done, collection, is all during this period of the pandemic. In that sense, it's very current and very contemporary. When did you start writing it? What triggered off? Why did you choose to write at this point in time? I know you might ask why should this question be asked? I mean, we were all undergoing it, so what better subject to write about? But still, in the lockdown, people were kind of busying themselves or working from home or doing something or the other, and you chose to write a book. What was the trigger, and how did you manage it?
Well, Ayaz, for me, as someone who has chronicled life around herself, around all of us, the pandemic triggered off just one response, which was panic. Like thousands and millions of people across the world, I said, I'm going to get up tomorrow morning, and that may be my last gasp. I may die a week from now. It was that sense of really I felt terrorized in the first few days, till one actually got used to the idea that it took much more than a week to get used to the idea. But it was so unknown. It was so scary. And it was an unprecedented. I mean, no one knew what had hit the world. And there was just one way to deal with it, is to crawl into a hole and say, I'm going to wait for this to sort of blow over and emerge. At that time, we didn't know that whether we'd emerge, 2 months from now, 6 months, 1 year, 5 years from now. We still don't know, quite honestly. So my only way of coping, it was therapeutic for me. It was a way of keeping, myself, my head, my emotions together. It was a way of staying sane on many levels. And the only way I know to cope with almost anything is to fall back on words. They're like my crutch, they're my companions, they're my love. And I started to write these stories. There are 24 stories in all, and here's the book. I started to write these stories hoping to share those feelings with everybody else, because there were so many mixed feelings. There was, well, predominantly we were all feeling anxious. And also we were testing ourselves, we were testing our own relationships. So I started writing the stories about 2 months into the pandemic, when we had sort of gotten used to what is called the new normal, and business of isolation. The feeling of claustrophobia was there, it's still there, but the story started to emerge because you stop looking so much into your own self. After 2 months, you get over your own panic and you start looking outside, and you start to respond to what everybody else is going through, people around you, people in your city. And for me in particular, how women responded to the pandemic in their own intimate relationships was key. And I tried to capture various moods of various people, including our migrant workers who are walking back. It's going to be the long walk of India that all of us are going to be responding to. And it will be the moment of the pandemic in India as to how we treated those migrants, and what the migrant may have endured, felt during this terrible, terrible time. So yes, so there are 24 stories. They were released during the pandemic. I wrote them during the pandemic, and Simon & Schuster, my publishers, are very keen that we published them while we were still in the throes of this whatever it is that we are going through even right now. And it happened just that way.
Yeah. So I mean, look, that's a fascinating dimension. The toll it takes on people, society, communities, and obviously also the country. And then there's the scientific aspect of it. And Emma, you did a lot of research about the Spanish flu, the grip as it was called then. So can you tell us a little about it and how it's different from COVID-19? What has changed from then in terms of the science and the medicine?
Sure, there's no comparison. We are so much better equipped to fight COVID than the world was equipped to fight the flu in 1918. First of all, they were already at the end of, in the final months of a terrible global war, so they couldn't do sensible things like stay home. They had so many soldiers, so many people moving around. It was an optimal circumstance for any virus to spread. Another thing, they didn't even know what a virus was. Doctors like the real doctor in my novel, Dr. Kathleen Lynn, she was doing autopsies and looking under microscopes, trying to find the bacterium which would be responsible. We now know you would have needed more powerful microscopes. So they didn't even know what a virus was. They had no good medicine for it at all. In my novel, they are doling out hot whiskey just to kind of comfort and sedate these women in a maternity ward, because one thing I found, which was the heart of my novel, was that women in late pregnancy were the most likely to catch it and to have terrible side effects or stillbirths as a result. Another difference was that they had so few other techniques. We have things like ventilators. They had very primitive oxygen machines, but they didn't yet know how to give it well. So they would give it for maybe just 5 minutes instead of continuously. So in many cases, there was absolutely nothing they could do except for keeping people rested and fed and hydrated. Medicine was in a primitive condition relative to that flu compared with now. So no matter how frightening COVID is to me, and I absolutely agree, it scares me every day, but our scientists are in so much better position, and they're able to communicate with each other so quickly. The international cooperation we're seeing in creating vaccines, for instance, all within a calendar year, it's amazing. So, for me, it's very comforting to look back at 1918 and say we're in a much stronger position, much more able for this fight.
Fantastic. So, in your book, Peter, and this is quite, I must, in fact, I'll just read this out because I plucked it out. This is something which is absolutely fascinating for me. In your book, you say that a sneeze was enough to cause cardiac arrest. People forget that they shouldn't shake hands. Jack McNeil, the protagonist, wonders how people can party in the midst of a pandemic. I mean, this sounds just so familiar with everything that is happening to us right now in our lives. I just got back from Bangalore yesterday, and that was my first flight I took from the city after 7.5, almost 8 months. And every step I was watching who's sneezing, who's doing what, because that's the sense of paranoia that you have. But you wrote this in 2005, and it was it a feat of imagination when you wrote it? What was there some research that you already had, which you wanted to substantiate? What are the sources? What really helped you build up such a scenario?
Well, I was able to draw on several sources. I mean, going back to the 1918 flu, a lot in America, a lot of American cities were shut down by the flu, and schools were closed, public meetings were cancelled, funerals were banned. In some towns, they even posted gunmen at the roads to shoot anybody who tried to approach. And that seemed like, at the time, it seemed like an extraordinary thing to happen. And, one thought this could never happen again. But when I started doing research for what a pandemic would look like in a modern city, I came across 3 documents. They were all pandemic preparedness plans. 2 of them had been put together by the National Health Service in the UK and the Health Protection Agency. Another one had been put together by the Americans. And they put a lot of thought into these, and projecting exactly how a pandemic would impact on any society and how it would break down in quite minute detail. So I devoured these, obviously, and they provided a lot of the inspiration and the background for me in terms of portraying a city in lockdown. The rest of it was largely imagination. I mean, I've always been, ever since I did my original research on the Spanish flu, I've been a bit paranoid about viruses and bacteria. And, my daughter calls me Howard Hughes. I've always carried gel around with me. And when I travel in airplanes, I've got disinfectant wipes. I wipe the seat arms and the tray. Because I know that, if somebody had been sitting in that seat before me with the flu or whatever else, they've left those traces all over the place, and I'm going to pick them up, because I'm going to be eating and putting things in my mouth and wiping my eyes. And, so I was very much aware of all that. So, I was kind of hypersensitive to it all, and just projected in my imagination what it would look like if everybody had to wear masks, if everybody had to socially distance, if the health services were overrun by the number of sick, and drew inspiration from the Chinese in 2003 during SARS when they built those emergency hospitals. So the opening of my book is the building of an emergency hospital in London, right next door to St Thomas Hospital, where the Prime Minister dies in my book. And the book came out just at the same time as Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, of course, caught COVID and was admitted to the self-same hospital that my fictitious Prime Minister died in, which was kind of alarming at the time, because I thought, if he dies, I'm going to get the blame for this, somehow as if I'd seen it all coming and brought it all about. But it's a combination of research and imagination that puts together this. And as it turned out, when I tried to get it published at the time, editors thought it was far too unrealistic. They thought, it would be impossible for a major Western capital city to be shut down by a virus. And so I couldn't get a publisher for it. 15 years later, well, the real thing came along. To be honest, I'd rather that book remained unpublished, because it would mean that there was no pandemic for real. And I think we'd all be happier if that was the case.
Well, you'll have a lot of publishers chasing you after this, Peter, for sure. In contrast to Emma and Peter, Shobhaa, you wrote your stories during this lockdown. This is, in a sense, experiential, though it's fiction, but you have been living through this like all of us. Which, kind of raises a question, is that, did you get enough distance from the events to get a perspective? Or, as I mentioned, was it just experiential, let it get out, that was the trigger? How much of a challenge was it? It must have been a challenge, because it's unraveling. Every day something new is happening, and you have to kind of chronicle it and write it. How much of a challenge was it for you to write fiction in a setting which was actually real and dramatically different from earlier. You're living in an unreal world, so to speak.
Well, Ayaz, it helps if you have a track record as a journalist. I've worked with you, so we go back a long way as a columnist in your papers and so on. So that training is there. You know that something is happening in the world which is so dramatic. And how can you let that moment pass without chronicling it in your own way, in your own words? But yes, you're right. There is just so much happening every day, even within yourself. So for me, the real battle was how much of it is to be the personal, and how much of it has to be what I'm actually hearing, seeing, observing, and responding to. But the passionate engagement with what was happening around me has always been something that has superseded everything else. I like to see, I like to hear, I like to observe, and I like to write what all those inputs, what all of it is meaning to me. And this was something I honestly at that time hadn't thought in terms of publishing. It was my way of merely recording what was going on, which was puzzling for everybody. And two stories in that, which came to me very strongly and in a way summed it all up for me and kept the impetus to keep writing more stories, was a story about a pressure cooker and a young girl isolated in her own, in a little flat away from her workplace, and the pressure cooker in her neighbor's house, which is full of children and people and lives that are still going on. People are still eating, and the pressure cooker whistle is driving her nuts because she has really not experienced that life in all its fullness. And here she is so completely isolated. So each time she hears the pressure cooker whistle, it reminds her of her own loneliness and her own life, which is in a way a metaphor for what a lot of us were being trapped. So that was one story. And then there was another one, which is how it impacted relationships one could take for granted. And I wanted to also, in a way, demystify the lives of doctors in real terms. We were at that point, and rightfully so, and deservedly so, they were being deified, they were the big heroes. But few of us thought what actually happened to these people when they were there in that hospital, in those PPE suits, having to deal with, they're human beings like us. Were they resenting that duty? So the lady in my story who's delivering babies in a maternity ward starts to hate the babies that she's forced to go there and deliver. She sees them as ugly little wiggly things that are coming into an ugly, awful world. And she wants to run away from her duty as a doctor. She wants to run away from her reality. And in the process, you also see the layers within her own marriage and the double standards and the class thing, which in India and cities like Mumbai, which is so evident. What happens when her own chauffeur, the driver, a loyal driver, tests positive? Are they going to keep him back, or are they going to sack him? And the story ends very clearly with the lady saying we can't have him back. So, and we'll extend some kind of monetary help, but that's about it. And human relationships took a huge hit. And the story is really about that, how different people reacted.
Yeah, human relations and how people react in a crisis really is coming through in the book, certainly. But Emma, so when you're writing a book, obviously, or anybody writing a book, people's characters and personalities come into sharper focus when you're dealing with a pandemic. It's not an ordinary situation in life. So could you kind of tell us how your characters reacted to this crisis in your book, and kind of how it finally changed them, if it did change them essentially?
By focusing on a small maternity ward where heavily pregnant women who have the flu are kept together, I tried to create an atmosphere a bit like the trenches in World War I, where men bonded so fast and so strongly with each other because they were all risking life together. So similarly, I tried to create an atmosphere so intense and, non-stop action, so grueling, that I thought my nurse, my doctor, and my volunteer could all bond very quickly, even though they are strangers to each other, and the novel only takes 3 days. My readers of a previous novel of mine, Room, will probably know that I like to keep my characters quite confined. I find that you can sort of, create a pressure cooker, turn up that heat between them. And one interesting thing I had not expected was that because everyone in my book has the same enemy, they're all aware of random death coming for them, they can actually treat each other pretty well because there's so much built-in conflict. They're all fighting death. So actually, they're enormously helpful to each other. There's a little bit of arguing between one of the nurses who's a nun, and Julia Power, my main character, who's a nurse. But, there is not devastating arguments between them because, they're all aware of death all the time. So I was actually able to create a story in which people treat each other pretty wonderfully. Without any danger that would all be too pleasant, because at any moment one of them can die.
So Peter, in your book, you kind of discuss and describe how governments and corporations respond and profit from other people's misfortunes, and that's really the human condition. That's been the story of humankind, unfortunately. So, but from your own experience of being in London, the helplessness of people and the powerlessness of people, and we all saw what happened at that point in time when the COVID wave first came, and not willing to acknowledge even that there was a pandemic. Can you tell us what the situation then was, and when you were in London?
Well, I wasn't in London when the pandemic broke. I live in France, so I have a very different perspective. I live in rural France.
Okay.
In fact, fortunately, one of the least affected areas in France by the virus. So, but we were still obviously confined, or that's what they call it in France, confinement, like confinement. You're learning at that point exactly what it feels like for your characters in your story. Although, obviously, in my book, the main character is a cop working out his last 24 hours before he quits the force, and he has a murder to solve in the middle of this pandemic, and he becomes kind of obsessed by it. And obviously, the conditions in which he has to conduct that investigation are such that it totally focuses him in a way that probably nothing else could. He also suffers personal loss, the loss of his son during this to the virus, and so it's a personal battle between personal loss and professional obsession, and I think we all get faced by these dilemmas when we're hit with the real pandemic. I'm kind of stuck here. I have a home studio here, which is where I do most of my work. During the actual lockdown in the UK, when my book Lockdown first came out, I found I was in huge demand by the press and the media worldwide. So I was sitting here doing live radio, TV, press interviews, day after day after day, which kind of mitigated it for me, took my mind off it all. A bit like Shobhaa, who turned her mind to writing and creative things. At that time, I was kind of assailed from the outside by all this desire for information and for me to talk about the book, and that made it, in a sense, easier to cope with. The more interesting thing that has emerged since then is I have just finished writing my new book, and that book is set now. It's set this autumn, and I'm confronted with the dilemma: do I take account of the changes to society forced upon us by the pandemic in the writing of this book, or do I ignore it and just write the story as if it didn't exist? And I know a lot. I've heard a lot of writers talking about this and facing up to this dilemma and saying, well, how will they deal with it? And quite a few of them have chosen to set their books in other times as a kind of avoidance therapy, and others have chosen just to ignore it. I personally, I think you have to address it. I think in a way it's the job of the writer to write about the world we live in, and you simply cannot write about the contemporary world without taking account of coronavirus and the effect that it's had on our society.
Well, I'm going to come back with a couple of questions on the post-pandemic, situation for all you writers. But let me get Shobha's answer for this question on this round on the book she's written. So, Shobhaa, your stories explore how the pandemic has put pressure on social relations and people's perspectives and people's characters. In fact, one of the characters says it was only when the lockdown happened and we were stuck with the baby at home that all these things, all these things started to bother me. In another story, and this is coming out again from the book, a character refers to the disease as China wala bimari, which reveals the effect of a larger political narrative, if I might say so. So could you talk about the different settings in each story? Because obviously that's where a lot of the flavor and the ambience in your stories has come. The social settings and the way that the pandemic has changed relationships and people's social standings and people's understanding of themselves and the people around them.
I lost a few of your words, but if I can piece what you were asking together reasonably. How did personal relationships get impacted during the pandemic?
Yes.
I think a question we'll all be asking ourselves, even in our most intimate relationships, our own, as well as wondering about the relationships of people around us. But a lot of my stories were about the young, in young marriages, like you mentioned, the story with the baby. And I know that a young divorce lawyer friend of mine received the maximum number of distress calls, panic calls from people saying, I don't care if the family courts are shut. Can you file for virtual divorce? I cannot bear the man I think I knew, I loved, that I'm married to. So a lot of marriages broke up, a lot of relationships broke up, a lot of marriages of long standing, there were huge question marks because we hadn't spent that kind of time with one another in a forced situation. So the intimacies, instead of getting people a lot closer, actually underlined the huge divide that a lot of relationships, a lot of people have stopped acknowledging, talking about, sharing. And strangely enough, young people started to wonder about sex. I mean, they hadn't had it in years. They always thought it's because they didn't have time for it. And now that they had the time for it, they didn't want it anymore. So it was a very strange, we are still going through a very strange period. But referring to what he was saying earlier about the new book, should it in any way, my second book came out, when it came out just about 2 or 3 months ago, which is completely different, has nothing to do with the pandemic. Yeah. It's a very raunchy, risque novel about a lady with a sense of adventure, and it's erotica. And maybe it was my way of getting away from, like you said, it could be avoidance writing, it could be getting away from the pain of the pandemic, which we are all still dealing with. And Sheila Ji is a book that's anything but depressing or any of that. It's about a woman in charge of her life and doing exactly what she wants. So I think all of us have responded in many different ways as writers, but the fact that we have responded is important, because through that sharing of our different experiences, we've been able to create bridges with so many different communities on so many different levels. I had the most extraordinary responses from readers. I really miss meeting them. I miss my Litfest. I miss those real interactions. I mean, here what we are attempting today is brave, according to me, and fantastic. It's all virtual, but I wish all of us could have been together at one of those wonderful Litfest, Anil's Litfest, and sitting on a stage and getting the vibrations from the audience, and then meeting each other later and chatting about our work. I miss all that, Ayaz. I'm sure you must sense that too. It's quite different sitting in a room by ourselves and trying to communicate.
Yeah. True. And there's this new phrase for it. It's called the new normal. I don't know how long this new normal will last, but certainly we miss what was the old normal. That much is for sure. So I have one, and I'm just throwing this open. So the pandemic has had its impact in a myriad ways on medical science, what will happen there, on the economy, on society, on the politics in different nations, and certainly in democracies. And that's becoming a big, debate and a talking point in personal relationships, in human psychology. Where you could choose any of these and dwell on it for, a minute, minute and a half. I'll start with Emma. If you think, what do you think will be the most significant outcome of this? Will it be in politics, in economics? I'm sure it'll have ramifications in all these, areas. But where do you see the maximum impact?
Well, one thing I found most interesting this year, which I would not have predicted, was, during lockdown, certainly in Europe and in North America, the way so many people started to get interested in the Black Lives Matter movement and in the fact of racism worldwide. I would not have seen that as an obvious outcome of people being afraid of catching a virus. And I was in my novel, the one thing I'm so glad about with The Pull of the Stars is that I chose to set it in an inner city hospital where women from the slums are coming, because it meant that the novel focused on all those pre-existing conditions of poverty. In Ireland, it was not about racism because everybody was pretty much looked like me, but still, a certain sector of society were considered worthless, sort of street trash, and the fact that their water was bad, their air was bad, their food was bad, they were living in damp conditions. Of course, they were already so much weaker by the time the pandemic came along. So I tried to make it a study of how pandemics are not random. They hit hard the people who we have all agreed to allow be kept down beforehand. Pandemics are just X-rays revealing social inequity. So I suppose because my novel had already focused my mind on that, I've been most interested in how people are now asking the big questions about how we live, where we spend the money. That it's not nature who can be blamed for pandemics. It's the social arrangements that we have voted for.
Peter, your turn to take strike.
Well, it's odd. I think they're observing things, particularly where I am in France, looking back on the UK. I'm obviously Scottish, and there are lots of stresses and strains politically with regard to devolution and independence. I mean, there's been a general trend over many years now, I think, of an increasing lack of trust among the public for politicians. And I think, in a way, the pandemic has brought that into a sharper focus. And the way that different governments and different politicians have dealt with the pandemic and presented it to the people has thrown up some stark contrasts. I think, to a large extent, people in England, for example, are much less trusting of a government that they feel has, by and large, let them down during the course of this pandemic. A government that sent them mixed messages in many, many ways, who have spent billions of pounds unchecked by the normal checks and balances enforced by government, money that's gone to cronies and pals to provide services that have proved totally inadequate in fighting the pandemic. You contrast that kind of, and that's manifesting itself now in the fact that people are very, very unhappy about going into another lockdown, about being barred from seeing one another, about having their Christmas taken away from them. And if you contrast that with what's happening in Scotland, where the devolved administration headed by Nicola Sturgeon, for example, has been on television every single day and talked to people as if they're adults, dealt with the situation in a very serious way, and really gained the trust, by and large, of the majority of Scottish people, who are much more likely to be compliant in the sense of following the advice of the government. And one consequence of that is that it has created a greater division between Scotland and England, and probably also Wales and Northern Ireland, but the push for independence in Scotland has been so powerful over the last few years, and now really during this pandemic period, polls in Scotland are showing a big well, a reasonable majority now for independence, which never existed before. And I think that's really a political consequence of politicians either failing to live up to what's required of them or stepping up to the plate and doing a good job. You can draw your own conclusions from my views on that. But
yeah, and also the original 007 James Bond is also no longer there to be a bridge. Yeah. Shobhaa, you've been, disguised, undisguised, in your column. You've taken short shots, sometimes openly, sometimes, obliquely, but making the message clear as to how this pandemic in many ways has been handled or mishandled in our own country or even elsewhere. So what's your take on this? How do you think it panned out? How did it play out?
I think every line written by a writer in whichever context is actually political. There's nothing like non-political writing. Whatever we say, however we choose to say it, is making a strong political point in our own different ways without it necessarily being political in a very obvious and overt way. So the word that Peter used, which is a very important word across the world, is the word trust, the T word. And there was a huge trust deficit. Here in India, there were charges of monumental mismanagement. There were charges of collective denial by the government in the initial stages. The fact that the government chose to ignore the migrant workers till the entire world woke up and tried to wake them up to say that this is a human tragedy that is avoidable, completely manageable. You cannot be this callous, you cannot be this heartless. At the sight of those people walking thousands of miles without food, water, and any hope for the future to get away from jobs that was what was keeping them alive. That tragedy is something that's going to haunt us. The way we responded to it is, I think, shameful. Till it was a matter of, I don't know, prestige or votes, which is generally what it is. And the government suddenly reacted and announced all kinds of little sops. I don't even think those sops ever made it to those migrant workers, whatever was promised to them, even by their own state. Half of it even reached those guys. But we are such a resilient country. We are remarkable in how we believe in karma. It was eventually the people of India who said, the hell with the government and what they are going to do for us or not do for us. We have to do it for ourselves. And there were marvelous and inspiring examples of how people, doctors, and all the frontline workers decided to come together even without actually organizing it as a movement, but everybody rallied. Look at what happened in Dharavi, which is often called the biggest slum in Asia, and how they coped with it, and how they emerged as heroes and victors without too much, or any government aid and intervention. So the human spirit triumphs over the worst governments. And I think that was the biggest message of this pandemic. Certainly for
it's
us.
20 hours.
We will continue to do what we need to do. And we're not going to be counting on this government or the next government for sort of pulling us out of this. We'll do a great job pulling ourselves out of it by ourselves, as we always have.
So I've actually exceeded my time limit by 5 minutes. I don't know if Gillian is ready with her questions, or can I ask another question? Gillian, can you hop in and let us know what's happening?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Gillian.
Thank you. That was a wonderful and very interesting conversation. We've received quite a few questions from our audience. May I begin? The first question is for Emma. What do you think of the distinction that many people make between literary fiction and commercial fiction?
I suppose it's a handy device for showing readers which books they might want to read, but it's not always correct. I know that I have often picked up a prize-winning literary novel and been left so cold by it that after 10 pages I say, I'm too old for this, I'm in my 50s now, I don't have time. And I'm deeply moved by popular fiction. I'm thinking of something like that novel, The Deep End of the Ocean, about a woman whose child is kidnapped. You know, that had me sobbing. So all these things are just sales techniques. You know, again with labels like Irish fiction, women's fiction, gay fiction. They can be convenient to show readers what they might want to buy, but it would be a shame if we allowed them to be boxes to keep any writers inside.
Absolutely. Thank you, Emma. Would Peter or Ms. Day like to weigh in on that question as well?
Peter, gentleman first.
Oh, sorry. I agree with Emma. I think the whole idea of genres in fiction is just a marketing ploy. It's about targeting certain kinds of books at certain kinds of people and trying to sell them. I think good writing is good writing, whether it's literary or popular fiction. I mean, the very word popular tells you that it's popular, therefore it's selling, and that people like it. You know, so let's not denigrate that. You know, we're all storytellers at the end of the day, and we want to entertain people. We want to entertain people with truth and insight, but we still want to entertain them, so that's always important.
Well, I think these kind of categories, it's pure hogwash. It's marketing, yes, but it's also a way to pigeonhole writers into specific categories and make sure they stay there. Like chick lit, for example, I find it a very offensive term because we don't have dick lit, so why should there be chick lit? Why create this kind of meaningless boxes to stick people into? And it's very often, I think, women are at the receiving end of all manner of labeling, because it's just more convenient to call them a certain kind of writer, depending on many things other than their ability to tell a good story. The whole narrative about women who write is very, very different from the narrative around men. And it's often women who find themselves being extremely objectified because of these kind of categories. It's like high art and low art. I mean, who decides what's high art and what's low art? These are all very arbitrary, very subjective ways of judging anybody's work. And like Peter and Emma both said, I mean, a good story is a good story, and a book is a book is a book, and the ultimate judge is the reader and nobody else. And you cannot manipulate a reader into adoring your book, no matter how hard your marketing team might try. So they'll either like it or they'll reject it. So to me, the reader is God, and I think of the reader as someone who keeps us all going with all our passion and all our truth. They keep us motivated enough to write the next book and the next. Even if the previous books have not been amazing, you still want that reader to say, hey, you know what, I'm looking forward to your next book, and I'm sure that's going to be like, wow. And they're not talking categories, right? They're just looking at a story that they will engage with.
Thank you. That's a fabulous perspective. May I move on to the next question?
Yeah.
This one's for Peter. How do you think governments have responded to the pandemic, and how does the British government's response now compare with what your book describes?
I think almost universally governments have been extremely slow to respond. To begin with, they seem to be in denial. When the pandemic, or as it was then, epidemic first began in China, and it became clear that it was moving out of China and starting to spread out into the world, I heard somebody describe that as being like a slow motion tsunami. We all saw it coming, and yet governments did nothing. They waited until it washed up on their shores, by which time it was too late. So they didn't respond quickly enough. They didn't respond forcefully enough. And you know, after the initial lockdown period, certainly in the UK, they started to lift the restrictions too quickly, too much, too soon, and let it back in for the second wave. And you know, with the fixation being on the economy rather than people's lives, you know, you can always rebuild an economy. You can't give people their life back. You know, and it seems to me that should always be our priority. But the fact that they prioritized the financial aspect over the human aspect has actually, not intentionally, but it has led to a worsening of the economic effect by the fact that we've had this second wave, which looks like it's just going to get worse and worse and worse across the winter. It's difficult to make that comparison with the government in the book, because the bird flu would have been so much worse than the coronavirus. I mean, the death rate from bird flu would have been anywhere between 60 and 80%. As compared to 1 or 2% with coronavirus. So, you know, the governments were simply overwhelmed, and in my book, and would have been in reality by bird flu. Coronavirus, in a sense, has been much more manageable, but it's been terribly mismanaged. With 1 or 2 notable exceptions, I think New Zealand, you know, handled it brilliantly, and has spared their population, that government there has spared their population the very worst effects of the virus, and also the financial effects. So there's a model. There were several models. Vietnam did very well initially as well. That none of the governments, certainly here in Europe, really took cognizance of. Too late, too slow, and with their priorities all in the wrong place. My personal view.
Thank you. Would you like to weigh in, Ms. Day or Emma or Mr. Memon?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that in India, there's also the other factor, which is the class structure being what it is, and the politics of the class structure, which excluded the kind of care that was extended to the affluent and the rich, who were given priority in hospitals. Beds were made available for them, where oxygen tanks were made available. The best surgeons were there for them to help them through this crisis, whereas the poor were just left to fend for themselves. And that is where a government needs to step in and step up. I mean, COVID hits us all in exactly the same way. So if we are going to be a society which discriminates in terms of treatment based on wealth, it says a lot about what we really need to think about going forward.
Absolutely. In fact, poverty is probably something that hit our country more than the virus as such. The next question is again for Peter. Why do you think irrational behavior is synonymous with pandemics?
Why do I think irrational behavior is synonymous? I don't know. Who's behaving irrationally apart from governments? I don't know. I think it's people get scared. I think fear is the predominant thing that we've all come face to face with in this pandemic, because we've seen around us people get it and they're gone in a couple of weeks. And it really brings it home to you just how easily that could happen to you, that, you know, just going to the supermarket, if you don't take the greatest of care. I mean, I read a thing recently saying that the #1 place for people to contract coronavirus is the supermarket. #2 was secondary schools. #3 was primary schools. #4 was your doctor's surgery or hospitals. You know, so places that we're all used to being and going to on a kind of regular or daily basis suddenly become death traps. One slight misstep and we've contracted the virus and we could be gone. So fear produces irrational behavior, I think, because, you know, none of us really knows how to deal with fear at that imminent level.
Thank you. Our next question is open to anyone who would like to take it, or maybe all three of you. How did your process for writing differ during the pandemic than writing pre-pandemic?
I would say that many of us are having trouble knowing how to write about the present moment, just like Peter said, in that we used to be able to set stories in a kind of a vague modern now. You know, there was some kind of agreed time slot in which You know, it was a world in which, say, you could have a character go to a Starbucks, and you didn't have to specify it was 2019 or 2010. It was all a vague now. And now it's as if there's this huge chasm in March 2020, and you have to decide which side of it you put your story, or you can't even put it slightly in the future because you don't know what's coming. So I agree that a lot of our fiction is going to fall heavily to one side or other of that. I'm trying to write something set in the very first week of lockdown, where at least I know exactly what was going through their minds then, but I wouldn't know how to move any farther past that. Because, of course, we don't just want to write about pandemic all the time. That's the thing. You don't want the big subject to suck in every story you try to tell.
Right. Thank you, Emma. Our next question is for Miss Day. This has nothing to do with the pandemic. Tell me about how you decide on your writing style and which authors' styles have influenced you. This is from one of our viewers. They haven't mentioned their name, though.
Well, let me start with the author style that I admired. I don't know whether it's influenced me. It's definitely Amy Tan. When I first read her, I was blown away by her narrative skill and also the fluidity with which she could combine different cultures, different centuries, and yet write a story which was so intimate, and it was really about a family or families. So Amy Tan is on top of my list there. Other than that, it's difficult to deconstruct how you evolve your own style. It is your own truth. You figure out, down the line, what works for you. For me, I've never tried to question it. This is the way I've always written, and I can kind of confess on this program that I found my old diaries, which I thought were, but I was hoping they were all lost, but they weren't lost. And at age 14 or 15, I was chronicling things around me, pretty much in this exact same way and style that I'm doing today at the age of 72. So yes, I mean, the language structure may have changed because you read more. There's so many influences and experiences in the interim. But the essential style and what I wanted to say has remained pretty much consistent. I would say each one of us comes to writing in a way that is almost, it sounds all very esoteric, but predetermined or predestined. Not that I knew I always wanted to become a writer, but it was clearly there in my diaries, the ones that written at 12, for example. It wasn't a diary about, oh, I went to school and the teacher said this to me and the boy next door pinched me and this is what happened when I was taking the bus. No, it was really not me talking about me, but me looking at the outside world, and that remains. So I guess with time, I hope the writing has improved, but the essential style remains the same.
Lovely. That's such a wonderful answer. It's basically your innate writing style. But would you say that your writing is an extension of you or your personal experiences?
You know, that's a question that's often asked only to women. It's like asking a science fiction writer that when was the last time you went to the moon or to Mars, or to ask a person who writes thrillers that, you know, how many bodies have you got in your home, how many people have you actually knifed, or do you carry a stiletto around? So I think women are constantly asked to explain their writing, explain their world, and I refuse to do any of that. I mean, you know, I write what I write.
Perfect.
Let me jump in, Gillian, here with a question for
Yes,
all
sir.
of them, and maybe that will lead us to the conclusion of this session. Is post-pandemic. I mean, I'm not saying post-pandemic in the sense that we still have to wait for the vaccine and how it works, etc., etc. But having gone through this process, lockdown, wave, second wave, all the terrible things that have happened and which could have been avoided, is there something brewing? Is there a post-COVID? Is there a trigger to do a post-COVID book? Because this is something which we have never seen and experienced in our lives, and we probably never will after this passes. Hopefully not. And it will leave a lot of deep impact on our minds and the way we think, our thought processes, Are any of you all working already in your mind, mulling over things? Because a post-COVID world might be a fairly different world from the one we've lived in so far. Anyone?
Peter, go for it.
Peter?
Thank you. I post-COVID world, my fear is that we're not going to learn anything from this in the long term. I don't, it will very quickly disappear out of the psyche of our society, just as the Spanish flu was forgotten about and became something beyond living memory. And we never believed anyway something like that could happen again. We'll very quickly get over this, assuming we do, and forget about it. And a generation down the line, or 2 generations down the line, something else is going to come back. And the one thing we need, or at least our governments need to do, is take account of the fact that there will be another pandemic, without any doubt whatsoever. What we do as writers, I think, is we just carry on reflecting the world as we see it and expressing our views of it.
Emma, Shobhaa?
Emma?
I would hope we will, just as a personal hope, I would like to hold on to an awareness that I should never take modern life for granted, and that I should be a little bit more picky about which elements I choose to try and recreate. I want to travel less, but I will really appreciate when I do. I want to be less busy, but obviously I want to go to the theater. So, but I think Peter's probably right in that we will forget at top speed. But right now I'm feeling I would like to hold on to a few of the insights from lockdown.
I'm missing hectic. I'm missing chaos. I love it. For me, that is the stimulus. So I miss all of that. I miss taking outrageous risks. I miss the idea of just getting up and going where I want to go, meeting who I want to meet, because that for me enriches me as a writer. Without hearing people's voices, without observing people wherever they may be, in bazaars and airports, I feel kind of lost. And the big change, I would say, I definitely don't want to slow down. I don't know how much, I don't know how long the pandemic will, but I want to grab and make the most of every single moment, with caution, of course, and with my mask on. But I don't want to give up on life. I want to grab everything that comes my way and make it last for me to the extent that it can, and it does. And I want all of that positivity to communicate itself to my readers. I don't want anybody to say, I surrender to COVID. No one should surrender to COVID. That's it.
Thank you. On that courageous note, I think we should, to kind of pull the curtain down on this session. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Shobhaa. And Gillian, is there anything that you need to add? I think we are.
I would just like to say thank you, Emma, Peter, Ms. Day, and Mr. Memon, for being with us today and for this very engaging and relevant discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our title sponsor, Tata, and to you, our wonderful audience, for being here and participating in the conversation by sending in all your questions. The books discussed during the session can be bought online at our bookstore partner, Tata Click. Coming up at 9 p.m. IST is what promises to be another riveting discussion, Trial by Media. Do tune in for that one. I know I will. See you there.